Sometimes the worst betrayals don't come from strangers, they come from the very people you trust the most. And if you've ever been in a situation where your heart was torn between loyalty to family and the burning truth of survival, then you'll understand why my story begins with a warning to anyone watching. Never be too blind to see what is right in front of you. Before I take you deep into what happened to me, let me just say this. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure you do. Because stories like mine aren't just about drama, they're about life, pain, survival, and finding strength when everyone else wants you silent. I was only 19 when my father, the man who was supposed to be my protector, began speaking to me about a man he wanted me to marry. At first, it sounded like the usual cultural push, the way some parents think they're securing your future when really they're just securing their own reputations or wealth. But something inside me hesitated the very moment I heard that man's name. I didn't know why, I just knew his presence in conversation carried shadows. People in our neighborhood whispered about him but never openly confronted him. He was wealthy, connected, and carried an aura of untouchable power. Still, the whispers were there, the kind you only hear when doors are half closed, when women lower their voices, when children are told not to ask too many questions. And the whispers were all about his wives. Yes, wives, 2 of them. Both gone. Both stories wrapped up with lies about illness and accidents. But the look in the eyes of the women who spoke about him told me the truth. This man wasn't unlucky. He was dangerous. When my father first mentioned his plans, he spoke with that fake calmness he always wore whenever he was forcing something on me. As if by lowering his tone and pretending it was in my best interest, he could disguise the cruelty of what he was doing. He said things like, "This man will give you security, he will make sure you never have to worry about money, he is respected." And on the surface it all sounded like a father's concern, but deep down I could hear the cracks in his voice that revealed the real reason. He wanted something from that man. Power, status, money, maybe all of it. My father had debts, I knew that. He had made mistakes in business, gambled away what little he had in secret games, and now he was desperate for a way out. What better way than to sell off his own daughter under the guise of a marriage? And yes, I use the word sell because that is exactly how it felt. But you can't just openly tell a girl to marry a man who has the blood of 2 wives trailing behind him, can you? My father tried to manipulate me instead, painting the man as misunderstood, saying the rumors about his past were exaggerated, claiming his wives had been weak and sickly. But you know what the truth is? A lie repeated enough times becomes the rope that strangles the liar, and my father underestimated me. The first time I met the man, my stomach twisted into knots. He was older, at least twice my age, his hair thinning at the temples, his smile cold like it had been rehearsed in a mirror. He looked at me the way someone looks at property, not a person. His eyes didn't search for my soul, they measured me, like he was already calculating where I'd fit in his world, how quiet I'd stay, how obedient I'd be. I tried to be polite, I tried to listen as my father encouraged me to smile, to nod, to serve tea like some fragile doll who didn't know the storm that was about to consume her life. But inside me there was fire, and fire doesn't stay hidden forever. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, remembering the way the man's fingers tapped against the table as if he were impatient for something, remembering how my father laughed too loudly at his jokes, eager to please. And in the silence of my room, I realized something terrifying. My father didn't care if I ended up like those other wives. He only cared if he could climb higher. That was when I decided to search. I dug into the past in ways no one else dared to. Old newspapers, faded clippings, gossip tucked away in the corners of tea shops, and even whispers from one of the man's former servants who had run away years ago. The pieces started to form a picture that made my blood run cold. The first wife had supposedly fallen down the stairs, but the servant told me she had bruises long before that fall, bruises she covered with makeup and scarves. The second wife had supposedly died of poisoning from bad food, but there had been rumors she had screamed for hours that night, neighbors hearing but too afraid to knock on the door. And yet, somehow, the police never pressed further. Money, influence, silence. It was all part of his shield. But now I held those whispers in my hand, like tiny sparks waiting to ignite. And here's the thing. Once you hear the truth, you cannot unhear it. And once you know a fire is burning, you either let it consume you or you rise from it stronger. I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I knew I had to expose everything. even if it meant turning against my father, even if it meant standing alone against both of them. Because silence wasn't safety, it was a slow death, and I had already chosen life. The day my father officially announced his plan to the family, it was as if the walls of our house themselves leaned in to listen. He gathered my uncles, my aunts, and a few neighbors under the pretense of celebrating a new opportunity, but I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't a celebration, it was a transaction. I stood in the corner, my hands clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms, forcing me to stay silent as he boasted about how I would soon be married to a man of great status. He painted a picture of wealth, of stability, of doors opening for our family. Everyone clapped, everyone smiled, but I caught the small flickers of doubt in the eyes of a few women, the way they lowered their gaze as if hiding the truth they dared not speak. I wanted to scream then, to stand on the table and tell them all what this man had done, what shadows trailed him, but my father's grip on my wrist under the table was a warning. Stay quiet, or you will regret it. That was the moment I realized just how deep his betrayal went. He wasn't just trying to control me. He was willing to sacrifice me entirely to save himself. But silence wasn't an option anymore. I began gathering evidence with a desperation I had never felt before. I searched through my father's drawers when he wasn't home, finding letters, receipts, and even a hidden contract that hinted at financial arrangements between him and the man. My heart broke as I read the words. My dowry wasn't just about tradition. It was a payment, a deal, a way to clear debts. And worse, my father had promised obedience from me in exchange. He had signed me away like property. I could hardly breathe, but anger has a way of sharpening the mind. I remembered the stories I had collected, the servants' whispered testimony, the old newspaper clippings. I put everything together, writing down names, dates, suspicious circumstances. It was a puzzle with missing pieces, but the picture was clear enough. The man my father wanted me to marry was a murderer hiding in plain sight. The night before the engagement ceremony, I sat by the window staring out into the dark, clutching the folder of papers I had pieced together. I knew that exposing him would not just ruin the marriage plan. It would shatter my father's reputation, bring shame on my family, and possibly put me in danger. But what was the alternative? To walk into a marriage I knew was a death sentence? To live each day in fear that I might end up like those women, silence forever? No. I made my choice. I would not walk quietly into the trap laid out for me. I would fight, even if I had to fight alone. The engagement day arrived like a storm brewing in the distance. Guests filled the hall, laughter and music swirling in the air, but my heart pounded with the rhythm of war drums. I watched as the man arrived in his expensive car, stepping out with a smile that never reached his eyes. My father rushed to greet him, bowing his head slightly, a gesture that made bow rise in my throat. To see my father, the man I had once admired, lower himself in such desperation for wealth, it was almost worse than the marriage itself. But I held my silence waiting because I had a plan. When the speeches began, when the attention shifted toward me and the man, I stood up, my voice steady though my hands trembled, and I said, "Before this goes any further, there are truths you all need to hear." The hall went silent. My father's face turned pale, his hand reaching out as if to stop me, but it was too late. I had begun the fire, and nothing could put it out now. The silence after my words was deafening. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your skin, that made every heartbeat feel like a thunderclap in your chest. All eyes turned toward me, relatives frozen mid-smile, neighbors leaning forward, and the man who was supposed to be my fiancé stiffening in his seat, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. My father rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a screech that echoed across the hall. His voice trembled with both rage and fear as he hissed, "Sit down. Now." But I didn't sit. For the first time in my life I refused to obey him. I held the folder of papers in my hand like a weapon, and my voice, though shaky at first, carried across the room with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "Everyone here should know who this man really is." I began, my eyes sweeping over the crowd. I saw confusion etched on their faces, the curiosity of people desperate for drama, but unsure of what storm was about to break. He is not the respectable businessman he pretends to be. He is not the honorable suitor my father has promised you. This man has blood on his hands, the blood of women who trusted him, who believed they were safe in his home. Gasps rippled through the hall, a murmur rising like the rustle of leaves before a hurricane. My father lunged toward me, but a group of guests instinctively stepped between us, as if sensing that the truth had to come out, no matter how dangerous. I pulled out the first piece of evidence, a faded newspaper clipping detailing the mysterious death of his first wife. Found drowned in her own bathtub. I read aloud, my voice firm. Ruled an accident, though she was known to be terrified of water. I slapped the clipping down on the table where everyone could see. The second paper followed, an article about his second wife, who had allegedly fallen from a balcony. But witnesses say she screamed before she fell. I continued, my eyes locking on the man's face. He didn't flinch, but the coldness in his eyes betrayed him. And yet no investigation was ever pursued. Why? Because he paid, bribed, and silenced the truth. My words cut through the air like blades, and the guests began whispering furiously among themselves. Then I revealed the contract I had found in my father's drawer, proof that he had negotiated not just my marriage but my obedience, in exchange for money to cover his debts. The shame on my father's face was almost unbearable to watch, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. This is not a marriage, I said, my voice rising now. This is a trade. A deal between a man drowning in debt and a predator who thinks he can buy another victim. Tears burned my eyes, but I forced them back, unwilling to show weakness. The room erupted. Women clutching their mouths in shock, men shaking their heads in disbelief, children looking around in wide-eyed confusion. The man who was supposed to be my husband stood now, his mask of charm gone. He stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You don't know what you're talking about. But his calm was cracking. I could see the storm beneath his skin. Be very careful with your words, girl. His threat hung heavy in the air, but I stood my ground, meeting his gaze without flinching. The truth doesn't need to be careful, I replied. It only needs to be heard. And with that, I handed the folder to one of the community elders present, a man with enough respect that his word carried weight. He flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each piece of evidence. The whispers grew louder, no longer whispers but voices rising in anger, outrage, betrayal. My father tried once more, his voice breaking as he pleaded. She's lying. She's confused. This is slander. But even as he spoke, his hands shook, his face pale, and his voice lacked conviction. He knew deep down, the walls of his lies were crumbling around him. And then the final blow came. Not from me, but from the very people he thought would support him. A neighbor's wife stood up, trembling, her voice cracking as she said, I saw him once years ago, dragging his wife by the arm. She begged for help. I didn't speak then, but I can't stay silent now. Another voice joined in, an old family friend who admitted he had been bribed to stay quiet after the second wife's death. The hall was no longer a place of celebration. It had become a court of reckoning. By the end of that night, my father's legacy was in ruins, and the man who was supposed to be my husband left in a storm of fury, his reputation scarred beyond repair. But I knew this was only the beginning. Exposing him in public was one thing, ensuring justice was another. The whispers of the community could only go so far. What I held in my hands was not just a folder of evidence. It was a weapon that could dismantle the life my father had built on lies. As I walked out of that hall, my heart still pounding, I knew there would be consequences. But I also knew something else. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking as a daughter chained by her father's control. I was walking as a woman who had chosen truth over fear. And that was the beginning of my real freedom. The days that followed felt unreal, as though the air itself had shifted and every familiar face now carried an expression I had never seen before. The whispers that began in the hall that night spread like wildfire through our town, each retelling stripping away the last remnants of my father's carefully constructed image. The man who had once been feared, respected, even envied, was suddenly the subject of contempt and pity. People avoided his gaze in the marketplace, neighbors crossed the street to keep from acknowledging him, and old friends who had once laughed at his table now refused to return his calls. It was as though the walls of his kingdom had collapsed overnight, leaving him exposed to the raw and unforgiving eyes of the world. But the fall from grace was not just social, it was legal. The folder I had handed to the elder was more than a collection of suspicions. It was evidence enough to spark investigation. Documents that traced his debts, his agreements, his exchanges with the man who was supposed to be my husband, and even copies of police reports that had once been buried under bribes began resurfacing. Within a week, officials had visited our home, not with the false politeness my father was accustomed to buying, but with sharp questions and sharper eyes. He tried to bluster, to bargain, to intimidate, but without his reputation to shield him, his voice carried no power. The very men who had once bowed their heads to him now spoke with the authority of law, and every word they wrote down chipped away at the empire of fear he had built. For me, the house became a battlefield of emotions. I walked through its corridors, the same corridors where I had once felt invisible, silenced, unseen, and I felt both triumph and grief. Triumph because I had spoken when I was not meant to speak, and grief because in bringing down my father, I had also destroyed what little illusion of family I once clung to. He sat in the living room most days, staring into nothing, his once booming voice reduced to mutters of denial. My mother, caught between loyalty and shame, avoided my eyes, and when she did look at me, her gaze carried both sorrow and fear, as if she couldn't decide whether I was her daughter or her executioner. The man I had been forced to accept as a fiancé disappeared from town shortly after the scandal broke. Some said he left for the city, others whispered he fled the country. His wealth and influence would likely shield him for a time, but his name was tainted now, and wherever he went, the shadow of his crimes would follow. I thought often of the women before me, the ones whose lives had been silenced, and I carried a strange, heavy guilt that I had survived where they had not. Their stories had ended in whispered funerals and unanswered questions, while mine continued in fire and revelation. I made a silent vow to them that I would not waste the chance their silence had bought me. In the weeks that followed, the community itself began to change. Women who had once lowered their heads now lifted them, emboldened by the sight of someone who had dared to speak. Conversations that had once been hushed in kitchens spilled openly into the marketplace. Stories of abuse, of deals struck behind closed doors, of daughters treated as property rather than people began to emerge. My act had torn open a wound, and though it was painful, it was necessary. The truth had been festering in the shadows for too long, and once exposed, it could no longer be ignored. And as for me, I discovered something I had never known before: freedom. It was not immediate, nor was it easy. The weight of what I had done pressed on me in ways I couldn't always name. There were nights I lay awake, wondering if I had ruined my life, if my future had been sealed by the anger of a father and the hatred of a powerful man. But there were also mornings when I woke and felt the sunlight on my face and realized it was the first time I could breathe without fear of what was planned for me. I began to write, to pour out every thought, every memory, every hidden truth into journals, determined that if my voice had finally been found, I would never let it be silenced again. One evening, weeks after that disastrous engagement ceremony, I returned to the hall where it had all begun. It was empty now, its walls echoing with the ghost of that night. The gasps, the murmurs, the shouts of rage and disbelief. I stood there alone, breathing in the silence, and I realized something profound. That space was no longer a memory of shame or fear. It was a monument to courage. My courage. And maybe, just maybe, it would inspire someone else to stand, to speak, to refuse the silence that chains us. My father's downfall was the end of one chapter, but for me, it was the beginning of another. I had been the daughter who obeyed, the bride who was meant to be sold, the girl who lived in the shadow of men's decisions. But now I was something else entirely. I was the woman who spoke, who exposed, who survived. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one truth had become unshakable. I would never again trade my voice for their silence.